which we have done, because
we can't even begin to we can't even welcome each other right now without diving headlong into this material, which is super, super powerful. Is the word that I used to describe it initially. And what is the power? Where is the power in this, right? So the power to me is the it's the way in which this lens is so comprehensive, right? So it gets into the heart of relationships. So social relationships, and you see them everywhere, right? That's the will to change. Sorry, why don't you introduce us?
Yeah. So for everyone who doesn't know, who missed it, this week is our first book club week. And I had randomly ran into The Will to Change by Bell Hooks in my local bookstore, and suggested to James we read it. And you were excited for it too. So that's what we're talking about, which we found incredibly powerful. And holy Jesus, we have a lot to say.
Yeah, for sure. Before we start saying all the things, I'm gonna suggest that you maybe dial your mic down a little bit. You're coming in just a hair hot. I don't know if hopefully.
So we're just gonna move my mic.
There we go.
I moved it from me a little bit. Is that better?
Well, I mean, it remains to be seen. So it's really just clipping, right? So it's not like your level is too high, but we're just getting a little bit of clipping. So hopefully between you hearing that, I mean, you're going to be animated again, within the next 15 seconds. So
I know I can do it here. Hold up. How is that? Is that better? No.
Well, maybe. No. I mean, I don't know. We'll see. We'll find. It'll be great. All right. So. Okay. So really, I want you to. You had suggested that you might frame this discussion out a little bit.
Yeah. So
were you able to do that?
You know what? Not really. Because I was too excited about too much of it, and there's no way we would get to my framework. So I decided not to worry about that so much. But I thought there were a couple of areas in the book that were particularly relevant. I thought it would be useful for us to talk about, well, generally what we thought. Maybe talking a little bit about the way Bell Hooks frames patriarchy, so that if we choose to use that word, if that word comes up, because of course she uses it a lot, that it makes some sense to people, because it's not a word that makes sense to people.
Yeah, I think yeah, for sure. I'm just going to interrupt you right away. That was one thing about the framing that it took me a little while to wrap my head around. Not because I have any particular dissatisfaction with the word, except that it sometimes can, it can be both too general and too precise at the same time. And so what I tried to do is I tried to go through the book. After reading it, I tried to just go through and try and get the best aspects that are super, super real, tangible aspects of masculinity, and or this political system, right? Because that's what she's arguing, is that patriarchy is this political system. It's an informal political system, versus a formal political structure, where obviously our formal political structure is the U.S. government, and we have a nominal democratic republic, etc. But
absolutely.
But she's saying that there's a sort of embedded informal social political system that is patriarchy, and then she uses that term. She uses that term to describe a thing that I think we can maybe sometimes it's not clear to me that I understand it fully, but other times I think it's a useful word, and if we just like at least to start with give it a limited sort of like, this is what exactly we're talking about, right? So
Right.
I think you're right on with that. But anyway, so go on.
Yeah, and I would think I'm grabbing my definition right here, or what I think is the easiest shorthand is that she's talking about a baseline idea within our culture that is, by our culture, I mean American culture, right? We're just talking about America here. But that is built around the idea of there being a need for domination.
Yeah.
Period.
Yes. Yeah. And that I think, and so I switched about halfway, because she kind of switches, like she continues to use the term patriarchy, and patriarchal system or patriarchal culture, but then about halfway through, she switches to dominator culture.
Yeah.
And I thought I was just like sitting there, and I'm like, no, that's really great, because she sort of she hesitates when she gets to the part where she's talking about how women are more and more seeking to embody these qualities.
Yes.
And then she says like, but that, at first she's like, but that just is like women are taking on the mantle of patriarchy, or and that's, and that gets messy. The more we do that, the messier it gets, because what patriarchy is supposed to do is supposed to integrate this political system with these aspects of masculinity that we're regarding as toxic, and that is something also very real, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And so like when, and so I like the way that she switched, because dominator culture is something that we can say that is very precise, and is it's a more full account of this particular aspect of American society. And then also, I want to like get into our conception of masculinity, which is different, related, and integral to dominator culture as we understand it, right?
Right.
But then regard that as something separate, right?
Yeah.
Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Absolutely. And I think femininity as well is defined default through this dominator dominated dichotomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is really integral to the way we end up defining ourselves and talking about these things, and realistically, again, to set like a framework for where I'm coming from, and like people are free to completely disagree with me. I am not interested, for the purpose of this conversation, in trying to discuss biology in air quotes with regards to any of these topics, right? Because it's unknowable, in my view. It is unknowable what is biologically driven in humans, because we are so culturally driven.
Right.
And so that's why I keep specifying we're talking about America, right? Because though we can agree, many cultures around the world have a dominator perspective and have historically been patriarchal, that's not what we're concerning ourselves with, right? We're concerning ourselves with American performance of masculinity and femininity and how that affects us. So
and so and so well, so let's do this then. I think you still had a little bit left on your list, right? So we were going to give our account. We're going to talk about patriarchy, and then what was the other thing that you wanted to say?
Yeah, so I really wanted, because we have talked before, and we have prepared people for our perspective as parents. I thought speaking a lot about.
You cannot read this book. You can't read this, but this is a parenting book, right? Like this, that's what this is. It's not. I mean, you get a little bit about society and a little bit about politics, and a little bit about like, but yeah, the vast majority of this is just like and really what the author is saying is that, like, hey, all of this happens in the developmental stage of life, right? Like, that's where, that's like anything else, like any other values or any other culture or any other, like, sure, there's a little bit of development that happens after your kids are out of the house, but like, you teach them how to be human, or at least they learn how to be human from being a child in your house. And like, that's where you can make a bunch of mistakes or maybe you can do things more or less well.
Right. And we'll definitely go into that. And then I thought it would be interesting, probably at that point we'll be at our hour, and we will want to talk about, she talks a little bit about maybe ways we could heal. And she talks about the word integrity. And so I thought that would be a nice conclusion for us. But I think we're going to burn through a lot of other topics. But those were the things I thought we should get at, for sure.
Sure. I mean, is your expectation that we're gonna go like a normal length of our podcast?
No, we can totally split it into 2 episodes.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm here for it, right? I've got nothing to do today. This is my day off. I deliberately scheduled this to be on my day off. So so we're
I have 4 hours, so I think we're good to go.
Yeah, like, so Karen, my wife, was like, what did she say? She said something about, I don't know, we were just talking about how it's like, I'm like, this is not gonna be an hour. This is gonna take a long time, right?
I brought my chapstick, man. I am ready for this. Let's do it.
Okay, well, so why don't we start with you? Overall impressions of the book, such as is reasonable to give an account of in this moment.
Okay. Yeah. So overall impressions. Number one, so for anyone who doesn't know, the book was written 2003. Is that accurate? 2004. And so as such, it is clearly dated. And some of the topics that she discusses, I was bummed, right, that we don't have an update, so that was something I experienced. But that being said, I found it to be really affirming of a lot of things I have suspected, right? Particularly with regards to her indictment of women for upholding the things that they don't like in men. And in particular, I can think of people in my life, women in my life, who have told me they cannot abide seeing a man cry. And that has always struck me as, as a shame, right? But it also has made me very sad for the men in their lives. That the men in their lives aren't allowed to be human, right? To cry and to grieve is human. Like, I don't know how many mammals produce tears out of emotion, but not many, right? Like, how are we going to strip that from a whole gender? Because if we see a man cry, then I guess we have to stand up for ourselves if bad things happen. Is that the fear? I don't know. She talks a little bit about what she thinks the fears are, but yeah, that, as she got into the ways that certainly we always talk about men entrapping other men in a performance of masculinity. That's almost always the way I see it framed. But to have her go hardcore into women perpetuating these things for the men in their lives, I was like, fuck yeah, and also check myself, right?
Mm.
When am I doing this, right? How am I participating? Because of course I am, because I'm a child of this culture.
Mm-hmm. Is that my dog is like, what is he doing right now? I don't know.
Dog
He
things.
might have dog things. Well, when my dog does anything, he does things that he shouldn't be doing. So mostly he just doesn't do anything. Mostly he just lays on the couch, and that's awesome for me. Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah.
What was your overarching thing that struck you?
So there were, I mean, yeah, right. So many things. I'll say a little bit about what you mentioned.
Yeah.
That particular insight about the way that women in our culture have a tendency, or can have a tendency, to respond to men showing emotion can be they can respond in a variety of ways, right? And so for instance, like the way that you described the idea that the women in your life that you'd spoken to about this would say, I can't abide a man crying, right? And so, like, how are they responding to that? Are they saying like, hey, you can't cry right now, or whatever, like I can't deal with this? Or are they responding by getting confused and like running away? Or are they responding by the way that Bell Hooks herself said that she would respond, by crying herself? Right? So like you can stifle someone else's emotional output or outpouring in more ways than just telling them, hey, you can't do that. Right?
Yeah. We tell people they can't do that a million and one ways. Exactly.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point that out, because if we hear, well, you can't, when it's your role to, what we should take from this, or what I take from this, is that it's our role in those situations, regardless of the baggage around gender or the baggage around emotions that we bring to the table, to do everything that we can to stop ourselves from putting up all of the defense mechanisms that we have to protect ourselves from other people's emotions, right?
Yeah.
And those defense mechanisms are probably seemingly benign, right? Or at least they probably seem to conform to our set of values, right? If our defense mechanisms were obviously problematic, then we wouldn't have them. Like, obviously problematic to us, right?
Right.
And so what we really need to say is, looking back, I never told them not to share, right? I never told them that it wasn't okay for them to make themselves be heard or felt. And yet, every time they do, somehow we figure out a way not to make that happen, right?
Yes.
And so, like, that might be a better way of approaching the whole question of, like, why it is.
For sure. And like, I felt, reading that little bit.
Did you feel a little called out?
I felt real called out. I felt real called out, right? Because I absolutely have been aware of this. And she talks about this, that like women are always like, oh, I want my partner to share more. I want them to tell me all their inner world, and I want them to be here. And the moment they do, I lose my shit and freak out. And then my partner has to take care of me. And look, the order is restored.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't always do that. And I'm definitely better about it now than maybe I was when I was 25. Right? But it has been an effort to unlearn. It has been an effort to say, like, this thing was never modeled for me by men when I was young. And so it freaks me out, but that's my job to handle, not to put that back on my partner.
that is a really powerful insight. That is a really powerful insight. So what you just said, that it was never modeled for you by men when you were young. So what you're talking about here is the relationship that male father figures, male parent figures in a household have with their children,
Right.
right? Which is different than what, you know, the relationship that male figures have with their partner,
Correct.
right? And in a relationship that sort of embodies this we'll say patriarchal framework, right?
Mhm.
So and bell hooks talks a lot about this, and this is probably, as far as overarching perspective, or a reflection on the book for me, is like the relationship that a father has with his kids, and the types of vulnerability a father allows himself to display in front of his kids, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot to unpack there, but you just tied it in very nicely, right? Because what you did was you and she doesn't connect it this way. I mean, I'm sure she didn't connect it this way because she knew it. She didn't decide to write it, whatever. Like it's a relatively short book, right? I'm sure she knows. I'm not saying that she didn't have this insight or intuition, but you make a very, very nice case here that it could be the reason that women are so adverse, and why it's so anathema to hear a man be vulnerable, right? Is because their entire lives, the most important men in their lives have gone to incredible efforts to protect their children from experiencing their vulnerability.
Right. Yeah. And I think, as related to that, she uses the phrase father wound, right? That we carry, which is this wound of a lack of emotional connection many of us might have experienced because our fathers were not, maybe, right?
Emotionally
Not for
available,
everyone.
right?
But yeah.
We might as well say that too, real quick. Like, and I would wince just every once in a while, because she can be. I mean, she's making a very powerful case, and she's, she has to approach it with confidence, right? And sometimes that presented to me as a little heavy-handed, right?
Agreed. Yeah.
But
I would also say she is a generation older than us.
Absolutely. And what she was saying was unequivocally true about many people today. So there's no, you're not getting any argument from me to say this isn't an issue in our society or anything like that. But and like you say, she's, it's dated not just in the fact that it's technologically dated, and our society has evolved regarding those things, but also like our cultural institutions and patriarchy has evolved a lot.
Correct.
From the time that she grew up to the time that she wrote the book to now. And so so I'm very, there's a tremendous value in everything that she writes.
Well, and for our listeners, like, one of her pivotal stories she tells about being a child is related to her brother and her playing marbles, right? So that's the kind of, so when she writes and is heavy-handed and is very all people, all men, all women, right? It's from that perspective as well as the Southern perspective. And so I think all of those things, take it with a grain of salt, that, we can only write what we know.
It doesn't have to be reflective of my experience for me to be able to put myself in this, in this position, right?
Yes.
And I think that's just more about like how to actually listen to people, right? People are going to say things that they understand from their experience, and our all of our experiences are necessarily unique, and the way that you listen is you try and empathize.
Hell yeah, man. Hell yeah.
Speaking of empathy and emotion and connection. So I wanted to talk about what it was about masculinity that she was directly calling out, right? Like, so I think maybe the best way to make this accessible to a general audience, right? Would be to maybe begin with sort of the proposition that masculinity takes a certain form in our culture, and there are characteristics, features of masculinity that that men in our culture are compelled to demonstrate. Men in our culture are inculcated into adopting as values around their masculinity, right? Like, if we can all agree with that, then we might say that there are several ways in which that's true, that are potentially problematic, right? If not potentially, then most certainly problematic. And like, we should talk about what those are. So, like, do you have, I pulled a bunch of things, but I'd be curious, what, if we were to try and make this as concrete as possible, what would you say?
Right? Well, I was looking here because I thought for sure I highlighted where she talked about that. And of course, I ended up highlighting so much.
It's just useless. Like,
it's almost useless. I also did that when I took notes in college. So, there we go. But I think it is. Okay. So she's talking here about ways that we attempted to maybe win male love, right? And particularly our fathers. But she said, so many of us felt that we could win male love by showing that we were willing to bear the pain, that we were willing to live our lives affirming that the maleness deemed truly manly was because it withholds, withdraws, and refuses, right? And that really struck me. That there is something about masculinity that is tied to ideas that I associate with stoicism and with rationality and with denial, withholding, withdrawing, like those. I mean, she at some point talks about the Hulk, right? About denying the inner beast, right? And that's what makes a good man.
Yeah, I want to talk about that for sure.
Yeah. So I think for me, what came out of this as an insight about masculinity was that association with suppression of self. Okay, go.
Okay, so suppression of self, suppression of our violent, rageful self. Right. So that's like, that's so important. That, I mean, that's, if this book teaches us anything, it's about this idea that we have developed as a society to regard like the ultimate, we might say the ultimate male, but even, the ultimate dominator, right, in our culture.
Thank you.
as being violent and rageful, but able to control that and only allow that violence and rage to manifest in particular contexts that are appropriate, right? But that it is still fundamental to our being, and right, and that's
Right.
and just to be clear, like that's not what the author believes, and it's definitely not what I believe.
No.
But but it is something that we romanticize for sure. And she uses the Hulk as a way of pointing that out, right? Like and again, the author dating herself a little bit, she's talking about the people in her life and the TV shows that they're growing up watching, and the Hulk, right, being one of the favorites, the childhood favorites of boys and men in her life, when they were boys. And what is the premise of the Hulk? The premise of the Hulk is that he has this violent beast inside him, and that when it comes out and he does his violence and rage and damage and destruction, that it's somehow like it's validated.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's validated. That's like the way you deal with any sort of conflict or problem or tension or whatever it is in your life. And
Right.
that's not just it's not just like okay, it's like to be romanticized.
Correct.
And so
Correct.
that is like could be the whole basis of an entire several podcasts, right?
Oh, for sure. For sure.
So one thing I'm gonna pull up, I have my notes, but I of course we live in the 21st century, and so I took my notes on my phone. But my phone is my camera, and so that's not useful.
Oh, yeah.
But then I sent an email to myself with my notes, and so now I'm like not engaging with you on the stream, but like looking at my notes here.
That's okay. So I will read another quote from the book related to what you were just saying, which is she was talking about why are there so many young boys going out and committing random acts of mass murder, right? Which of course is still plaguing us despite how dated this is. And she says, yet no one talks about the role patriarchal notions of manhood play in teaching boys that it is their nature to kill, and then teaching them that there is nothing they can do to change this nature. Nothing, that is, that will still leave their masculinity intact.
Yeah, right. Is that what they need to do instead, is learn how to deny emotion so that they don't let the beast out of the cage.
Right, but that you must have the beast to be a man.
Yeah.
And so one could even say, just from that proposition, that she is defining maleness or masculinity as the conflict that you are required to live in and to display.
Yeah.
That is I am good and I am rational because I have so much rage within me and so much violence that I could bring to bear at any moment, but I don't.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why I'm good.
Right. So yeah. Important again. I really want to get to, so I want to pull up my list here of things that I've come up with regards to what it is. We can call it toxic masculinity, call it patriarchal masculinity, call it dominator culture, or whatever. But the bottom line is, these are aspects of what I think is commonly accepted in our society as being maleness, that most people, even notwithstanding their frame, can accept as being like legitimate aspects of maleness, right? And so there was a list of 7 that she wrote, that she quoted from a paper, and I'm just gonna share it.
Oh, yeah, I remember that list. I highlighted it.
So yeah, so the 7 stereotypes of maleness, right?
Yeah.
And we can go into every one of these, right? So avoiding femininity,
yes.
Right? Restricting emotionality, seeking achievement and status, self-reliance, aggression, homophobia, and non-relational attitudes towards sexuality, right? Now,
Yes.
we hear stuff like self-reliance, and even to a lesser extent, seeking achievement and status, as not being like overtly negative aspects of maleness. Like, I don't think that if you think of like yourself as needing to be self-reliant, that's like a big problematic thing for you to want to identify this way. Like,
Yeah.
but I would as I wouldn't give as much as much I wouldn't be as generous with things like the anti-femininity. Like, that is such a feature of
It really is.
of our culture, right? And to the degree to which that came up in a very explicit way in my daily life yesterday.
Oh my
right?
God, tell me.
So, and I'm going to protect people involved, right?
Yeah.
Not that any of these people are close enough to this podcast, but just
Yeah.
as a sort of ethics of podcasting, I'm not going to say anybody's name, but so we'll say this: people who are men who are regarded as effeminate, right, suffer bullying.
Absolutely.
Right? Men who are regarded as effeminate suffer bullying. That's a reality.
Yeah.
Right? That's been a reality my whole life. Now, what does it mean to be effeminate? She talks about playing with Barbies or dressing up like a girl or whatever.
Yeah.
And those are just gender norms or whatever. And like, but it's the way that we respond to them. So it's not to say that, like, how do I put this? A desire to subvert gender norms,
Right.
can come from a place of I want to identify with femininity because that's part of my makeup, my personhood.
Sure.
Right? It can also come from a place of I want to deliberately subvert gender norms. It can come from lots of places, and me saying this is just to say, like, that's not as relevant to me as the response of maleness in society to the people that do that.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
We as a culture and masculinity as an identity regards boys, men who present effeminate, right?
Right.
As something problematic, something unmasculine, as something that we need to challenge, that we need to dominate, right? So if we think about that, like, that's what bullying is, right? Bullying is dominating. So and it's funny because if you might share that, you might share that someone is experiencing this bullying
Yeah.
because of their effeminate nature. And you might share it with a man, right? You might say, would you believe this person is dealing with all this hardship because of their thing? And they might respond by saying, where are they? Where are the bullies?
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And I find that a little bit ironical.
Right.
Right?
I'm going to dominate you into less dominance.
Right. And like, yeah, that's what effeminate men need, right? Is they need you to come dominate and protect them, right? That's not doing anything to challenge these institutions, right? So what we need, or what it sort of strikes me as being, especially after reading the book, as being a more appropriate response to that, is to model that your identity or sense of masculinity doesn't like what I need to show you through my behavior that doesn't define your masculinity, and it doesn't define your identity, right?
Correct.
I don't need to reinforce the dominance culture or the dominator culture by protecting you from being bullied by other people who are more masculine than you, but maybe not quite as masculine as me.
Right.
And that sort of that gets to the rest of the list, right? So like, and then also so restricting emotionality, we've talked about that already. Like we're trying to be invulnerable, or at least we're trying to protect you all from the rage from the beast within that is strong and powerful, and that can dominate through coercive violence. Right. And if you take that away from me, then you're stripping my masculinity from me, right? My ability to dominate through coercive violence, and that I have the power to take that away from me, but only through my stifling emotion and detaching myself and disassociating from my relationships. And
yes.
Go ahead.
So many things. And it strikes me, one thing that struck me with these kinds of topics, and she didn't make this connection, at least in the book, but she talked about the violence perpetrated upon children by both fathers and mothers as the first place we all learn this dominator model, right? Is, you act bad, you get an ass whooping, right? And hopefully that's less now than it was when she was writing, especially for when she grew up. But it strikes me that the same argument comes in here with regards to challenging the idea of benevolent use of violence, right? That, well, you know what? Like, it made me feel good when my dad went and threatened my bully with an ass whooping. Are you saying my dad's bad? And then all of a sudden, right, it falls into this whole thing of trying to protect all the men in our lives who we love, who did the best they could do. And so it becomes hard to challenge these ideas because it feels like we're calling people we love bad.
The other thing that strikes me from you saying that is just talking about benevolent, like the benevolent version of this, right? So she's constantly reminding us in the book that we're not looking to replace the totalitarian, authoritarian version of this with a benevolent version of this.
Right.
Okay, so there's that, and then she talks about let's
go back to the list.
So seeking achievement and status, self-reliance. So again, not they don't immediately strike me as being a thing that we ought to. And I think this gets to the question of whether or not we want to have a sense of maleness, right? Do we want a sense of maleness in society? Right?
Yeah. Well, that's uncomfortable.
Sure. Right. I mean, is it a good, what? Yeah. So do we want a sense of maleness and then have a good idea about what, a sense of masculinity that is better than what we have now? And she makes the argument that we should, that men need a sense of masculinity, and that we should replace the values, right?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that the values of like self-reliance are inherently problematic, but what they do become problematic when they're not balanced.
Yes. I would agree with that. I think yeah, it's hard, right? Because we are, I mean, particularly in America, like that is a founding fucking principle, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, go West, young man. But, you know, so I find it challenging to challenge the idea of self-reliance. That being said, I know I can speak even just for my own life. I view needing help as meaning I am less valuable as a person.
Mm.
Right? And that doesn't even have to go into masculinity. That's just being a American. And that is something I am desperately struggling to let go of because of that disassociation. In order for me to say, I got this, I can stand on my own 2 feet, means I have to tell you, no, go away from me. And that's maybe more harmful than any good I would get by the pride of having done it alone.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah.
I think I understate the harm of telling people, no, I don't want your help.
For sure, for sure. And so it may be that we in our culture have a sort of perverted sense of society, a perverted sense of what our relationships are and responsibility.
Right. And here's how powerful this is in our culture. When I rolled up, okay, you know, anyone that knows me, or if you don't, hi, welcome to the podcast. I'm a little space cadet-y sometimes, yeah? And sometimes I don't have my shit together. And this happened my daughter's first day of kindergarten. My oldest daughter, my oldest child, her first day of kindergarten, I don't remember exactly what was going on, but we were running late. And I was panicked and not quite sure how this was all going down. And then I layered on the panic of like, it's her first day and blah, blah, blah. And that didn't help. So we get to the school and there's a huge line of cars and there's a huge line of people and everything is mayhem. And like, I can't figure out where to park to walk her in. And my freaking 5-year-old says, don't worry, mama, I got this. And unbuckles herself and leaps out the fucking car and goes in by herself.
That's amazing.
Right? So I don't know whether I can take personal blame or we can just societally say that that was there. But my 5-year-old knew the phrase, I got this. I can handle it because clearly nobody else in this car is getting their shit together.
Right.
Right?
That's so funny.
So, I mean, it's a funny story. And I kind of love it. And it is her personality. But, you know, but I think that says something, right?
Yeah. 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 I don't, you know, and that like to challenge it would be
Okay.
a big. Well, no, I know I'm not. I'm saying I don't think I can. Right, like that would require so to challenge that would require. I love the way that she used. So she was talking about the attitudes or the perspectives that the early feminist movement had, and how they were unsatisfactory to her in a variety of ways. And she said, you know, maybe we need more complex theorizing. And like, I stole that. I'm going to use that every day for the rest of my life.
Yes.
So like, it would take much more complex theorizing than I'm equipped to engage with in the moment to be able to challenge that or to look at how we might challenge those types of things. But they're definitely real, and I think that there's a lot of value in this book, just identifying these types of things. So like, for instance, why is it that men in our society are so quick to to view femininity, and particularly femininity amongst males, right? But that just gets to show you why this idea of patriarchy, as sort of nebulous as often it seems, how that is, a perfect expression of what we're dealing with, right? The male sense that when boys or other men act like women, that they're less male, right? And that they have, and then that necessarily amounts to they have less power, that they should be dominated, or at least that I inherently have the power to dominate them.
Correct.
Right. And that is a real fucking thing. So like, regardless of where you're coming from on this, like, like think of that. But then the other thing too, and this is actually, so I'm reminded of an experience that I had. I was in a space of the domain of physical violence, right?
Okay.
For people who don't know, this is actually a martial arts podcast.
Right.
And, this wasn't a fencing space, but it was a space for training, developing skills that are associated with, or that are sort of meant to be the embodiment of physical dominance through physical violence.
Right.
And I had a pair of Uggs, because I wear Uggs.
Oh yeah, you do.
Because and
somebody they're comfortable.
Said, well, so somebody said, "Hey, is this female here? I mean, I didn't see this female come in. Whose Uggs are these?"
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh, those are my Uggs."
Yeah.
And they were like, "Why do you have Uggs?" And I was like, "Because there's wool in them."
Right.
They're lined with wool. That's amazing, right? And but the question that I had to ask myself at leaving, right? The question I had is like, what did I get the power to have the confidence to respond that way? Because I had established myself as competent in the domain of physical violence. Right? And I think that brings us to the question of the role of martial arts in all of this, right? And so like, and just the nature of domination through physical violence is sort of the underpinning of all of this, right? Because what underpins this whole system of maleness, of domination, of dominator culture, is the sort of implication that it's all backed up through competency in the domain of physical violence.
Correct. Yeah, that when push comes to shove, I will bring to bear whatever physical violence I need to. Yeah.
Right. And is it easier for me to subvert ideas of masculinity that I find to be problematic by establishing myself as socially establishing myself as competent in that domain? And I think based on the experience that I'm sharing, that like it's definitely true that I have.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, do you think that confidence is because you feel that internally you have proven yourself to yourself, or is it because you feel everyone in that space knew I was a badass because I had already proven it to them?
That's a question that I haven't been able to answer. That I have wrestled with, and that I haven't been able to answer. That is an exceedingly challenging question.
That is a profound question. Yeah, that's why I had to ask it. That's why I had to ask.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like one thing that occurred to me thinking about all of this was, again, since this is a martial arts podcast and theoretically a fencing podcast too, is I have, as a woman in these spaces, I've encountered a lot that is interesting. Some positive, some negative around gender and existing in these spaces. But relevant to particularly what we're talking about is that the perception of masculine or masculinity being an inherent good and femininity being inherently bad shows up in such subtle ways. For instance, I know many people who fence with swords too big for their stature, their strength, their experience, etc., because they don't want to fence with a quote unquote girl sword. People have said that to me.
Yeah.
I don't want to use a girl's sword. What are you talking about? A Roman sword was like fucking the size of a Bowie knife, and we still called it a sword, and they still murdered most of Europe, right? Like, what are you talking about? That it's feminine and therefore bad?
Right.
How weird.
It is weird, and I think in this case we can think of the general idea of masculinity as being representative of this sort of higher level idea of dominator culture.
Yes.
And so what we do is we replace. So we have dominator culture up here, and we replace the concept of the dominating with the male, and the concept of the dominated with the female, or effeminate, right?
Yes.
Right. And
that may be a more useful term for clarity for what we're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. And we see this even more subtly in it shows up as a weird homophobia in some of the discussions of fencing with a rapier versus fencing with a longsword. Homophobia shows up in that. That it's effeminate to fence with a rapier because people that fenced with rapiers wore pink.
Right.
Sometimes.
Right. It's we definitely back a lot of this stuff in. we back the data into the equation. But yeah, it doesn't. It immediately doesn't hold up.
Right. So weird.
It is. It's totally bizarre. But again, right? We say it doesn't hold up, but that's like upon analysis, right? Right, which gets to the heart of a lot of this is that there is no analysis.
No.
Right? Like there's no need for analysis. We just know these things, and they're useful heuristics to help guide our behavior and our and so challenging these ideas or these norms or whatever is like,
well, here's what we know. What we know is if we don't adhere to these norms, the threat of violence looms.
Yeah.